Welcome, church, to this edition of something that has no name that we're doing on Thursday.
In BJ's, and I called it Random Connected Thoughts.
Random Connected Thoughts, RCT.
It doesn't have to be that, but I just was
Random Connected Thoughts Thursdays.
There you go.
So today Damon and I are going to try to tackle a subject that is. Let's see if I can set this up, and then Damon, you help me. So I'm just going to blurt out some things, and then because we've talked about this, maybe you can help clarify. So kind of currently as we speak, the world in which we know it is pretty chaotic, whether it be the pandemic, some hard economic times followed by the murder of George Floyd, and then how the country is responding or not responding to that. And so we didn't necessarily today want to try to tackle the big issue of okay, so what do we do about some of these social issues and their effects on society and the church and this sort of thing. However, kind of what we wanted to do in shepherding Signal Mountain Bible Church, our flock well, is to take a look at whenever these things happen, how is it that we can take evaluation of our own hearts and our own lives, because something that we know, and we know through the book that we're studying, 1 Peter, is that as aliens and exiles in this world, we are in the world but not of the world, and our purpose is to be lights in the world. And so as we are experiencing this, this stuff is filtering into us, and where we wanted to really shepherd our people, I think, is to talk about what kind of grid are we filtering all of this stuff that's coming through. What kind of grid are we filtering that through? And so we wanted to take some time and talk about that. Now, is that fair? Would
Absolutely.
You add or subtract to that?
And I would add that, as you and I even talked some earlier, that we were talking about the fact that as we just sat with one another, just you and I talking, that we also felt like that we were seeking to be present with each other, I think one of the realities that we've been thinking about is that lots of hearts are being pressed. And as lots of hearts are being pressed, as you said, first of all, in a pandemic scenario, followed by things that we could have never expected. However, things also that have already existed in oppression and injustices. And I think the value of our conversation is talking about what are those grids, and that for us to hold out the gospel as what the grid is that we're seeking to process that through along the way.
Right. So that the reason that we are aliens is because we are gospel people, and that we are other kingdom focused. And so keep calling it grids. Our grids should be much, much, much different than the world's.
I think even just the grid of the gospel is it's inclusive. I'm drawn to Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, which obviously we again hear this in the New Testament as well. Because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, and to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting. So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that He may be glorified. And then even in verse 4, in this prophetic context, but playing out, then they will rebuild the ancient ruins, they will raise up the former devastations, and they will repair the ruined cities, the desolations of many generations, and just our reality is that in the face, even specifically of looking at a screen and watching something happen to a fellow human being, and what happens inside of us, that's either going to be connected to the gospel in us or it's not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I am personally feeling, in the tumult of my own soul, I'm feeling that dangerous place of when it's not
Mm-hmm.
connected to the gospel.
Yeah. You know, I think of, as you were reading those verses, I think of in the New Testament, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the gospel, and as we are called to proclaim that, I think we have to be careful, as you were saying, as we're swimming through issues, whether it be the pandemic or what's going on today with protest or rioting or whatever, that we have to be careful because as people who are redeemed but not yet what we will be in our process of sanctification, we've got to be aware that God is even using this stuff to sanctify us.
Absolutely.
And I think the place sometimes where we miss the boat is in times like these where it's just tumultuous. Are we paying attention to our heart? So, for example, when the pandemic, it's still going on. It's hard to, with everything going on, it's hard to just still imagine that it's still going on. But how is it? Let me ask you, maybe Damon, this question. I've certainly got some opinions on this, but how do you?
Belda has opinions.
I know I have opinions. Can you believe it? How do we know? Okay, when nothing's going on in life, things are just easy sailing. We can kind of hit on autopilot and do our thing, and there's not a lot of inner turmoil, let's say, if life is pretty good, and that's pretty easy. Times like this, how do we know when maybe we need to pay attention to what's going on inside of us?
I think that's really valuable, because I notice in my life that when there is little turbulence, either inside of me or even exterior as well, just bluntly honest, I'm aware of being able to live in my own systems because there's really not a need for the gospel in that way. And I notice, even in our conversation now and earlier today, that when, two thoughts here. First of all, things that are happening exterior to me, I think they point to some chaos that's going on in my own heart. I am not able to, and I'm not processing what the family of George Floyd is right now, specifically. And yet I'm aware at the same time that it's pointing myself to whether I will take stock of what's happening inside of me or not. And I'm noticing, even as we're studying through 1 Peter together, that it's clearly teaching that the people that the presence of suffering, which looks like lots of different things, begins to reveal things that maybe I haven't really been focusing on and paying attention to. I remember my conversation with BJ last week, where BJ was talking very honestly about kind of humming along in a school year, and then all of a sudden a pandemic hits, and then families are shifting, and honestly, out of that comes some uncomfortableness of what does this really look like as we don't necessarily depart away from each other into some of our normal routines, and we're on top of each other more. So I am seeing and thinking about the collective reality of all of these hearts viewing a pandemic, the murder of a fellow human being, and then how that then begins to affect my own heart along the way.
Yeah, I had a mentor that in seminary who would talk about that emotions were connected, and he would always kind of make this thing of there was like this direct road or string of these emotions that were connected to something inside of us. Mm-hmm. And so I look at, for example, the pandemic, and I want to be real clear what I'm saying here. So let's say, and I'll just speak personally, when this stuff first started happening and the government first kind of shut the country down in many ways, there was some anxiety.
Yes.
Some fear. And so one thing I could do is to try to push that fear away, or to do things where I didn't feel the fear, or the other option is to say, okay, fear is not a fruit of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. Because fear is not a fruit of the Spirit, I need then to ask the question, I need to begin to follow that road and to see what's going on internally that's producing that fear. And for me, it was, well, what's going to happen if all of a sudden, we stop getting paid and we can't, blah, 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 start running down this road. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden to that, I can start to apply God's promises. Of how to deal with my anxiety, to cast my cares upon Him, to realize that God is sovereign, that that this didn't take Him by surprise. Then all of a sudden my soul becomes quieted, and then the fruit of the Spirit starts to be produced of joy and peace and patience. Way less about, in my mind, and I'm going to stay with the pandemic for a minute here. Way less about the decision when I go out in public whether or not to wear a mask. That wasn't being motivated by this existential fear that I felt before. You and I could come to different conclusions about whether or not to wear a mask as we go into Pruitt's. That's a whole nother subject matter. But you and I could both existentially, at the core, be very peaceful. Mm-hmm. And you decide not to wear a mask, and I decide to wear a mask, and then out of that, all of a sudden, you and I can be walking along together, growing in sanctification, apart and together, because if we converse about that subject, it's not from this broken place. It's from a place of wholeness, of something that God is doing. Does that make sense of what we're trying to lean into a little bit here?
And I think, honestly, pushing on from the pandemic to watching a man's life being taken in the street. Mm-hmm. It's the complexity of how do we go from you and I being able to walk in unison with each other, even from different places, into Pruitt's,
right,
to what obviously continues to linger throughout our country and throughout our world of things that then escalate from walking into Pruitt's with a mask on. And I think just as you and I have sat together today, just acknowledging that's just really complex. And we are seeing this, it's been interesting to be listening and hearing the expectation of statements being made, and where is that being motivated out of?
Yes.
Why are we making a statement?
Right.
Are we making a statement out of a place of unity together, or out of this is what we should do? And I feel like that's a place where it's been getting a little cloudy inside of me and causing me to not be remembering the gospel.
Yeah. So a way to maybe be real frank about this would be, if I'm watching TV, I'm going to go to both extremes here, just to be fair.
Yes.
If I'm watching TV and I see if I see a black brother in the Lord who is saying something, and all of a sudden I find myself getting angry, what we're saying is, all right, well, trace that anger back.
Yes.
And say, why is that angering you?
Yes.
For sure, we'll get back to some of the filters that we need to take off, but why is that angering you? And I'm not even going to speculate of why. I'm just saying why.
Yes.
Use this time to really ask God, like, hey, will you sanctify me in this? There could be something going on internally that's not, that I'm not even aware of. Along the same lines, let's say that, as they often do, that I'm here at the church and a police officer is parked out front, and I just feel angry. Neither which of these things has happened, by the way. I'm just trying to go to both opposite extremes on this. I need to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Why does that anger me? And what is it in me that's causing this reaction? Because I think what that's evidence of, you read a passage that talked about justice and seeking justice, and God has given us emotions. However, I think that I think too many times we just want to quickly jump to, well, I'm angry because this, versus really looking inward, I guess is what I'm saying, and saying, okay, well, is there a part of my heart that is hardened to the gospel or that is sinful? And then the reaction that I want, do I want to display the gospel to the guy on TV or to the police officer? Do I want to be seen as light in darkness? Do I want to be seen as salt in the middle of a crazy situation? Do I want to be seen as somebody who would act as Christ acted? And or do I want to just join aside because that's kind of the easier thing to do, to be honest.
And I'm thinking about your sermon on Sunday, and even over the last few weeks, of how you have actually been exhorting us that we not be processing through a political grid, which ends up being a relatively easy thing to do. And then at the end of Sunday, one of your application thoughts is what is it that's motivating you? And I think even you said, how is the gospel motivating you in those things? And you and I have had conversation about the realities that some of this line of thought can be seen, quite honestly, as a cop-out of just like, well, maybe you just don't want to go there. And yet, either we're going to be conformed to the image of Christ, or we're not going to be. Either that's a reality, and I'm really most primarily aware of that conforming in my life.
That's it.
And so I am aware of just that trail back to my heart. Most of the time, when stuff's really hard, I think that I would rather not be paying attention to my heart.
Sure.
But I do believe that that's part of the call in a time like this.
Yeah, and I want to flesh out just a little bit more. So I think really kind of what we're trying to say is that the grid that we're filtering things through, that we really want it to be through the gospel of what we are called to be. The church, the Greek word means the called out, and so that we are. The church isn't an organization; it is a people who are called out together for the purpose of being salt and light, being reflecting the glory of God in the world. And if that's what we are to be about, then we have to be very careful how we're processing things individually. And some of the things that aren't helpful but that are easy to get involved with would be things like, that if being aware that my political bent maybe holds too much sway in my thought process and what's going on inside of me, because being aware that my position in society holds too much sway or whatever, versus saying, wait a minute, like, and I know this is so cliche, and this is where I really want to press into something, versus being aware and saying, that grid being like, how would Christ respond? Mm-hmm. And then what's preventing me from responding how Christ would respond? Mm-hmm. That's, I think, where the action is. Mm-hmm. The thing that gets difficult in these situations is that we get confronted with things that are not explicitly laid out in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where this becomes difficult. I had a conversation with somebody the other day with the current issues going on over everything that's happened, I guess, in the past couple of weeks with several, really three incidents with two young black man, black woman, and then George Floyd. Is, what becomes difficult is you ask the question, what would Jesus do? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very difficult question. Mm-hmm. I think there's some low-hanging fruit. Like, I think there's some low-hanging fruit on some things that are, well, of course, Jesus would want to see some reforms in things so that it makes things better in certain areas, of course. But bigger picture, really, on all sides of this coin, there has to be changed hearts for us to move together. Mm-hmm. And as Christians, this is where I want to maybe lead us, as Christians, is that we hold the market on changed hearts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Like, that's what baffles me sometimes, is that, like, well, I believe that the Holy Spirit indwells me and changes me. So we should be leading the way, even in difficult times, maybe not to some, I'm not saying we should be leading the way necessarily, although to political reform, but we should be leading the way to reforms as far as having hearts that are open to being changed when they need to be changed, whether that's dealing with race issues or the pandemic issues, that we ought to be a people who are leading the way in that. And so I think the call that we're really wanting to say is to talk about how beautiful this can be if we do the hard work of really taking time to not look at my brother and say, man, you are wrong in this, but to look inward and say, God, what are you doing in me, so that as I have conversation with my brother in whom I may agree or disagree with, we're relating on a whole nother plane. Yes. That's otherworldly in my mind.
Yes. And so even in the midst of that, if one of the main fruits that's coming up inside of me is, if that is what really is inherently true of me, the Spirit dwells in me, and I have this power to love and to live this way, but I don't necessarily see that playing out that way, then I'm being given an opportunity to pause and ask myself, why? What am I afraid of in this situation? Yeah. Why is this bothering me? And that I'm willing to wonder internally. And honestly, I've been thinking this thought. I said this to Leah a couple days ago. I'm just thinking about the reality of all of the conversations and God being aware of all of the conversations. And I think what I'm aware of inside is just like, God, how will you do this? Like, how will you do this? How will we change? And what I'm aware of is happening but actually part of what I'm saying is how will I change?
Yeah. And how can I be a person who, when I feel like I need to stand for something, that I'm doing that from a place of my heart being gripped by the gospel and the love of Christ in that stand, or when I feel like that I need to be in a position where I am more passive. I'm reviled, but I don't revile in return. As 1 Peter says, that I'm also doing that not from a place of fear, because that's really not fulfilling the passage. If I'm fearful of what Damon may think of me, so I'm not going to stand. Well, then, in my heart, I'm going to revile.
Yes.
I may not verbally, but I'm doing it in my heart, which is just as bad. Versus doing the hard work, so that when Damon reviles me, and for the sake of the gospel, I don't revile in return, I'm doing that from a peaceful place.
Yes.
And I think what gets tricky is the other one of times of taking stand on certain issues that we say, well, Lewis, people who take stands on issues aren't peaceful internally. And what I would say is, well, they could be. That's not both things can be true. I can be totally convinced that I need to stand up for the fact of you need to wear a mask in Pruitt's. That's a bad example. But you know what I mean. Stand up for XYZ from a very peaceful place internally.
Yes.
That wants your good
Yes.
versus wants you punished.
And that is about relating.
That's about
really
relating. Because and maybe that's to sum this up, because the gospel part of this is, I want my brother's good, and I feel like that God is moving me to speak and act in such a way to take a stand for the good of the gospel and for the benefit of my neighbor, and versus he is wrong, and I'm going to show you he's wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
So to end it up, and we've gone extra long this time, we intentionally in this are trying to walk a little bit of a tightrope, because what we don't want the end result of this session to be is to say, oh, Damon's taken this stance, or Lewis has taken this stance, or whatever. Certainly, we have our opinions and stances and this sort of thing. But what we really wanted to do in this time was to really point us to the harder work of saying, okay, how do we be gospel people in the middle of chaotic times, and how do we in the middle of this chaos look at remember that God is sanctifying us through this, and He is doing something in us through this. He is calling some things in us beautiful and calling it forward. Other things in us He is calling sinful and wanting us to kill those things. And so whether it's pandemic, whether it's the stuff that's going on with all the other stuff in the world, with the race relations and everything that's going on, that we as Christians are paying attention to what's going on inside of us, and so that this time isn't being wasted. That we're not just looking forward to hopefully a time where things feel more peaceful, because then this would all be wasted.
Yes.
And in this world, there's going to be another wave.
Yes.
And we, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of our neighbors, we must do this hard work so that we can be the light in the world.
Last thought.
Last thought.
And in the midst of the gospel and living out the gospel, there is a call to grieve and lament.
Yes.
And that is one of the ways that we will process our hearts together. Just even seeing some images, out of the chaos of civilians and police officers embracing one another in a very different looking picture, and just imagining what that moment might be like. So I know that we're grieving a lot, and that is welcome in the gospel.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you. God bless.